Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into a question that is at once incredibly simple and strangely difficult to hold on to for very long. What is pure consciousness? But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now, feel free to dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey into pure consciousness together. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. There is a moment, a very small, almost invisible moment, that most of us pass through every single day. You might notice it in the morning, just as you wake up, before your name returns, before your memories gather themselves, before you remember where you are or what day it is. There is a brief pause. In that pause, something is still there. You are not yet thinking. You're not yet planning. You're not yet worrying about anything. And yet, somehow, you are still here. It's a curious thing. If you try to remember that moment now, it might feel slippery, like trying to recall a dream that fades the moment you reach for it. But you've been there. You've passed through it, again and again. Imagine waking up in a quiet room. The light is soft. The air is still. There are no sounds demanding your attention. For just a second or two, there is no story in your mind. No voice saying, "I am this person," or "I need to do that." And yet, something remains. A kind of gentle knowing. Not knowing what, just knowing that. It's not a thought. It doesn't have words. It doesn't describe anything. It's more like a presence, a simple, quiet sense that something is happening, that something is aware. And then, almost immediately, the rest arrives. Your name, your plans, your responsibilities, your identity. Like actors stepping onto a stage one by one, until the full play of your life begins again. But that first moment, before the play begins, that is where our journey starts. Because that moment might be the closest we come in everyday life to what some researchers and philosophers call the most minimal form of conscious experience. Not the rich, detailed awareness you have right now, filled with images, sounds, and meaning, but something much simpler, something quieter. Something that exists even when almost everything else is gone. To explore this, we need to gently let go of a few assumptions. We often think that consciousness is tied to many things. Your memories, your emotions, your sense of being a person, your ability to make decisions. But what if those are not the core of consciousness, but just things that appear within it? It's a bit like sitting in a room. The furniture, the decorations, the sounds, they all fill the space. But the space itself is not the furniture. The space is simply what allows everything else to be there. In the same way, your thoughts, your feelings, even your sense of I, might be like furniture, and consciousness might be the space. Now, this idea can feel a little abstract at first. So let's bring it closer. Think about a time when you were sitting quietly, perhaps with a cup of coffee early in the morning. No rush, no noise, just the soft warmth in your hands and the quiet of the moment. For a few seconds, maybe longer, there was no strong thought pulling you in any direction, no urgent need to act, just a calm, steady awareness. You were not trying to be anyone, you were not trying to achieve anything, you were simply there. That kind of moment is easy to overlook. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel important. In fact, It feels almost too simple to notice. But sometimes the simplest things are the most revealing, because if you look closely, you might realize something surprising. Even when nothing special is happening, awareness does not disappear. It remains quiet, stable, unchanging in the background, like the soft ticking of a distant clock that you only notice when everything else becomes still. And this brings us to a gentle question. If we could slowly remove everything that usually fills our experience, the thoughts, the memories, the sense of identity, even the feeling of being someone, what would remain? Would anything remain at all? Or would everything simply fade into nothing? This question has fascinated scientists, philosophers, and meditators for a very long time. And rather than trying to answer it all at once, they've taken a different approach. Instead of building up, they began to take things away. Not abruptly, but carefully, gently, like removing layers from an onion, or like watching fog slowly lift from a quiet landscape, revealing what was always there beneath. They asked, if we take away memory, are you still aware? If we take away emotion, are you still aware? If we take away the sense of self, is there still something left? And again, the answer seems to be yes. Something remains, not a person, not a story, not a thought, but a kind of simple presence, a bare awareness. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't even know itself in the way we usually think of knowing. And yet, it is there. Some researchers describe this as the most minimal form of experience. Others call it pure awareness. And some suggest that it may be the foundation of everything we ever experience. But before we go too far into those ideas, it helps to stay close to what you already know. Because this is not something distant or unreachable. It's not something you need years of training to glimpse. You've already touched it, many times, in the quiet moment before a thought appears, in the stillness between two breaths, in the brief confusion when you wake and haven't yet remembered who you are. It's subtle, easy to miss, but always there. And as we continue, we'll begin to gently explore what happens when we look more closely at this quiet presence, and what it might reveal about the nature of consciousness itself. For now, there's no need to analyze it too much. Just notice the idea, like a small light in the distance, and let it remain there, softly glowing as we continue. If you stay with that quiet moment for a little longer, the one just before everything returns, you might begin to notice something even more curious. That sense of simple awareness doesn't actually go away. It doesn't arrive suddenly in the morning, and it doesn't disappear when your thoughts begin. It's already there, all the time. It's just usually hidden, like the sky behind the clouds. During the day, your mind fills with movement. Thoughts drift in and out. Emotions rise and fall. Memories replay themselves, sometimes softly, sometimes with surprising intensity. It can feel like your experience is made entirely of these things, like you are your thoughts, like you are your feelings, like you are the story constantly unfolding in your mind. But if you slow down just a little, you might begin to sense that all of these things are happening within something else, something quieter, something that doesn't change nearly as much. Imagine sitting by a window on a rainy afternoon. Raindrops slide down the glass, each one following its own path. Some move quickly, some linger, some merge with others, and disappear. If you focus only on the drops, the scene feels busy, unpredictable, constantly shifting. But if you relax your gaze just slightly, you notice the window itself, still, unmoving, unaffected by the patterns on its surface. In a similar way, your awareness might be like that window. Thoughts are like the raindrops. They appear, they move, they vanish. But the awareness in which they appear remains steady. And this can be difficult to notice at first, because your attention is usually drawn to whatever is most active. A loud thought, a strong feeling, a sudden memory. It's like listening to music and only hearing the melody without noticing the silence that holds it. But the silence is always there. Without it, there would be no music at all. You can explore this gently, even now, without doing anything special. Just notice your experience as it is. Perhaps you hear a sound in the background, the faint hum of a fan, distant traffic, or the quiet movement of air in the room. There may be a thought appears, something simple like, "This is interesting," or "I wonder what comes next." And then, another thought. They seem to arrive on their own, unannounced, uninvited. If you look closely, you might notice something subtle. You don't actually choose your next thought. It simply appears, like a bubble rising to the surface of water. You can't predict exactly what it will be. You can't fully control when it comes, and yet when it appears, it feels like your thought. But is it really something you created, or something that happened? This is one of the small mysteries that begins to shift how we understand ourselves. Because if thoughts can appear without being chosen, then perhaps the you who claims them comes a little later, like a narrator stepping in after the fact, saying, "Yes, I thought that." And still, throughout all of this, the awareness remains. It doesn't need to decide what thought comes next. It doesn't need to hold on to anything. It simply allows. You might think of it like the surface of a calm lake. Leaves fall onto it, ripples form, reflections shimmer and change, but the water itself remains. Even when disturbed, it does not lose its nature. And when things settle, its stillness becomes obvious again. In daily life, there are small moments when this background awareness becomes easier to notice, not because it suddenly appears, but because everything else quiets down. Perhaps when you're walking alone in the early morning, before the world becomes busy, or when you pause for a moment, holding a warm cup in your hands, with nothing urgent to do, or even in the middle of a conversation, when you stop speaking for just a second and simply listen. In those moments, there is often a sense of openness, a kind of gentle clarity, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just simple. And what's interesting is that this awareness does not seem to belong to any particular thought or feeling. It is not happy or sad. It is not fast or slow. It does not have a personality. It is simply present. And this raises another quiet question. If awareness is always there, even as thoughts come and go, then what exactly are we identifying with when we say this is me? Are we the changing content or the space in which it appears? This is not a question you need to answer immediately. In fact, trying to answer it too quickly can make it feel complicated. It's more like something you can gently notice over time. For example, imagine watching clouds drift across the sky. Some are light and soft, others are darker and heavier. They move at different speeds, changing shape as they go. If you only focus on the clouds, the sky seems full and busy. But if you shift your attention just slightly, you notice the sky itself, wide, open, unmoving. The clouds do not stain it. They do not leave marks behind. They simply pass through. And in the same way, your thoughts and experiences may be constantly changing. But the awareness that holds them does not seem to carry their weight. It doesn't become anxious when a thought is anxious. It doesn't become sad when a feeling is sad. Those qualities belong to the content, not to the awareness itself. This idea can feel a bit unfamiliar at first, because we are so used to thinking of ourselves as the things that change. My thoughts, my feelings, my story. But what if there is a quieter layer, one that doesn't change in the same way? A layer that is not defined by what appears within it. Some scientists and philosophers suggest that this background awareness might be closer to the core of consciousness than anything else. Not the thoughts, not the memories, not even the sense of being a person, but the simple fact that something is being experienced at all. And if that is true, then perhaps consciousness is not as complicated as it first seems. Perhaps at its foundation, it is something very simple, so simple that we overlook it, because it is always there, like the space in a room that you rarely notice, until you stop and look around. And as we continue, we'll begin to gently explore what happens when we try to understand this awareness more clearly, not by adding more to it, but by slowly, carefully taking things away. If you gently follow this idea a little further, the idea that awareness is always present, quietly holding everything that comes and goes, you might begin to wonder something quite natural. What is the simplest possible version of this? Not your full rich experience with memories, plans, emotions and identity, but the smallest version of experience that could still be called conscious. It's a bit like asking what is the smallest flame that is still a flame, not a roaring fire, not even a candle in a dark room, but just enough light to say that something is glowing. Scientists and philosophers sometimes explore this by slowly, carefully removing parts of experience, one layer at a time, not to destroy it, but to see what cannot be removed, what remains, no matter what. So let's try something similar, not as an experiment, but as a gentle thought exercise. Imagine your current experience just as it is now. There may be sounds, perhaps very faint. There may be a sense of your body, resting, sitting, or lying down. There may be thoughts, drifting in and out like distant conversations. Now imagine, very softly, that some of these begin to fade, not abruptly, just gradually, like lights dimming in a quiet room. First, let the stronger thoughts settle, the ones that carry meaning, plans, concerns. They don't need to disappear completely, just soften, becoming less defined. Then, imagine that memory becomes quieter. You're not actively recalling the past, not thinking about yesterday or tomorrow. Each moment feels more self-contained. Now let emotions settle as well, not because anything is wrong, but because nothing is pulling strongly in any direction. No urgency, no excitement, no tension, just a kind of neutral calm. And then, something even more subtle. Imagine that the sense of being a specific person begins to loosen, not disappearing suddenly, but becoming less important. Your name, your role, your story, they are not needed right now. They can rest, somewhere in the background. What remains? At this point, your experience might feel very simple. There may still be a sense of space, not necessarily visual space, but a feeling of openness, a kind of here-ness. There may also be a sense of time, but not in the usual way, not minutes or hours, just a gentle flow, a sense that this moment is unfolding. And there may be a perspective, not a strong eye, but a subtle orientation, as if experience is happening from somewhere, even if that somewhere is not clearly defined. This combination, a sense of space, a sense of time, and a faint perspective, is sometimes described as the minimal structure of experience, the smallest set of features that can still support awareness. And what's important here is not the terminology, but the feeling, because this kind of experience is not entirely unfamiliar. You may have brushed against it in quiet moments, perhaps when you're just waking up, but haven't yet remembered who you are. or when you are resting deeply, without thinking about anything in particular, or even in the middle of the night, when everything feels still and your mind is not yet fully active. In these moments, experience is not rich, not detailed, not full of content, but it is not absent either. There is still something rather than nothing, and that something is very simple. So simple, in fact, that it can be easy to overlook, because we are used to thinking that consciousness must be complex, that it must involve thinking, reasoning, remembering, deciding. But perhaps those are additions, layers that build on top of something more basic, like decorations added to a quiet, empty room. The room itself does not depend on the decorations, and in the same way, awareness may not depend on the layers we usually associate with it. Now, there is an interesting challenge here. If experience becomes this simple, almost contentless, how do we even talk about it? Because language is built for describing things, objects, events, actions. But this kind of experience does not have clear objects. It does not have a story. It does not have a sequence of events in the usual sense. It is more like a gentle presence, without edges. Trying to describe it can feel a bit like trying to describe silence. The moment you speak, the silence is gone, and yet we can still point toward it, indirectly, through examples, through metaphors, through small, familiar moments. Because even though this minimal experience is subtle, it is not unreachable. It is not something hidden in a distant part of the universe. It is something that appears quietly within your own experience, again and again. Another way to approach this is to notice what is not required for awareness to exist. You do not need a strong emotion. You do not need a clear memory. You do not need to be actively thinking, and perhaps most surprisingly, you may not even need a strong sense of being a self. This last idea can feel a little unusual, because we are so accustomed to linking consciousness with identity. I am aware. I am thinking. I am experiencing. But if we look closely, the I in these sentences may not be as stable as it seems. It may be something that appears alongside thoughts, rather than something that creates them. And if that is the case, then awareness itself may exist, even when that sense of I becomes very faint, like a light that continues to glow, even when no one is standing in the room. This brings us gently to the edge of a deeper question. If awareness can exist in such a simple form, if it can remain when thoughts, memory and identity are quiet, then what happens if we go even further? What happens if we remove not just most of the content, but all of it? No thoughts, no images, no sense of self. Would awareness still remain? Or would everything fall into complete silence, with nothing left at all? This is where things begin to feel a little more mysterious, because exploring that question takes us to the very boundary of what experience can be, a place where the usual ways of describing things start to soften and eventually fall away. And as we move toward that boundary, we'll begin to encounter something that feels both very simple and quietly profound. If we continue this gentle process of simplifying experience, letting layers fall away one by one, there is one layer that feels especially central to who we are: memory. It is so familiar, so constant, that we rarely notice how much of our experience depends on it. Your sense of identity, your understanding of the world, even your ability to recognize where you are. All of these are quietly supported by memory. It connects one moment to the next, like a thread weaving through time. But what would happen if that thread became very thin, or even disappeared? Not suddenly and not in a dramatic way, but softly, like a fading echo. Imagine waking up, but without the usual rush of recognition, no immediate sense of "this is my room," no clear idea of what day it is, no memory of what happened yesterday, just this moment, fresh, unconnected, new. At first this might sound unsettling, because we are so used to relying on memory to orient ourselves, but let's stay with the experience itself, rather than the reaction to it in that moment, without memory. Are you still aware? There may be a sense of space. You might still notice light or darkness, or the vague outline of your surroundings. There may be a sense of being here, even if here has no name, and there may still be a kind of quiet presence, not tied to any story, not connected to a past, not reaching toward a future, just this immediate experience. Now, without memory, something interesting happens. Each moment becomes complete in itself. It does not depend on what came before. It does not build toward what comes next. It simply appears like a single note played in silence, without any melody before or after it, and yet, even a single note is still sound. Even without a sequence, there is still something to be heard. In the same way, awareness does not seem to require continuity. It does not need a past to exist. It does not need a narrative to hold it together. It can exist, moment by moment, even if those moments are not connected in the way we're used to. This idea is sometimes explored in neuroscience and philosophy by asking, is memory necessary for consciousness? And while memory enriches experience, giving it depth, meaning, and continuity, there is growing evidence that awareness itself may not depend on it. There are cases, for example, where individuals with severe memory loss still report being aware in the present moment. They may not remember what happened a few minutes ago, but they can still experience what is happening now. They can still feel, see, hear, and most importantly, Sasa, be aware. This suggests something subtle, but important. Memory helps create the story of your life, but awareness may exist, even without that story. It's a bit like watching a film. The full movie depends on a sequence of scenes, connected over time. But if you pause the film at a single frame, that frame still exists. It is still visible, it still contains an image, even without the rest of the story. In the same way, each moment of awareness may stand on its own. It does not necessarily need to be linked to other moments in order to exist. Now, there is another interesting effect when memory becomes quiet. Without memory, the sense of being a continuous self begins to soften, because much of what we call self is built from remembered patterns. Your name, your past experiences, your preferences, your beliefs, all of these are carried forward by memory. If memory fades, even slightly, the sense of being a fixed, stable person can begin to loosen. Not disappear entirely, but become less solid, more like a suggestion than a certainty. And yet, even as this happens, awareness remains. It does not need to remember itself in order to exist. It does not need to say, I was here a moment ago. It simply is here now. This can feel a bit unusual to think about, because we are so used to linking awareness with continuity. We imagine that to be conscious, there must be a continuous stream, a flow that connects past, present, and future. But perhaps awareness is more like a series of gentle moments, each complete in itself. Not necessarily disconnected, but not dependent on connection either, like drops of water, each one whole, even as they fall in sequence. There is also something quietly peaceful about this idea. If awareness does not depend on memory, then it is not tied to the weight of the past. It does not carry regrets. It does not replay old stories. It does not hold on to what has already happened. Those things belong to memory. awareness itself remains untouched, light, immediate, present. And this brings us closer to understanding something important. Many of the things we associate with consciousness, memory, identity, narrative, may not be essential. They may be layers, added on top of something simpler, something more fundamental. And as we continue to gently remove these layers, we begin to see more clearly what might remain at the core, not as a theory, but as a quiet possibility, a kind of awareness that does not depend on remembering, a presence that exists, even when the story fades. And from here, we can begin to ask an even deeper question. If awareness does not need memory, what happens if we go one step further and begin to loosen the sense of self itself? As we continue this gentle process of setting things down one by one, we arrive at something that feels even more central than memory, the sense of being a self, not just remembering who you are, but the feeling that there is someone here, experiencing all of this, a center, a point of view, a quiet but persistent sense of, I am the one to whom this is happening. It feels so natural, so immediate, that it almost seems impossible to question. And yet, if we stay with our approach, slowly, carefully, we can begin to look at it more closely, not to remove it forcefully, but to notice what happens when it softens. Imagine again a quiet moment. You're sitting comfortably, nothing urgent to do, nothing demanding your attention. Thoughts may still be present, but they are not strong. They drift by, like leaves on a slow-moving stream. Now gently shift your attention, not toward the thoughts, but toward the feeling that those thoughts belong to someone, the sense that there is a you behind them. At first it may feel obvious, of course there is a you, who else would be here? But instead of answering, just observe. Where exactly is this you? Is it in your thoughts? But thoughts come and go. Is it in your body? But the sensation of your body changes constantly. Is it in a specific location, somewhere behind your eyes, or in your chest? If you look carefully, it becomes a little difficult to find, not because it isn't there, but because it does not appear in the same way as other things. You can see a shape, you can hear a sound, you can feel a sensation, but the self does not appear as an object like these. It feels more like a background assumption, a quiet idea that is always present but rarely examined. Now imagine, just for a moment, that this assumption begins to loosen, not disappear completely, just become less certain. Instead of I am thinking, there is simply thinking. Instead of I am hearing a sound, there is simply hearing. Instead of I am here, there is simply this experience unfolding. At first, this may feel a little unusual, because we are so used to placing ourselves at the center of everything, like a narrator inside the mind, describing and owning each moment. But if you step back, even slightly, you may begin to notice something surprising. Experience continues, even without a strong sense of ownership. Sounds are still heard, sensations are still felt, thoughts still arise, but the sense that they belong to a specific someone becomes less clear. It's a bit like watching a movie. Normally you are deeply involved in the story. You identify with the characters. You feel what they feel. You follow their journey as if it were your own. But occasionally, whereas something shifts, you become aware that you're watching a screen. The story continues, but your relationship to it changes. You're no longer fully inside it. In a similar way, when the sense of self softens, experience does not stop. It simply becomes less personal, more open, more like something that is happening rather than something that is happening to you. This idea is sometimes described in a very simple way. Not, I am experiencing this, but this is being experienced. It may sound like a small difference, but it points to a very different way of understanding consciousness, because it suggests that awareness does not necessarily need a central owner. It does not require a fixed identity to function. It can exist as a kind of open field in which events appear. Now, this does not mean that the self is an illusion in the sense of being unreal. It means something a bit softer. The self may be something that is constructed, something that appears as part of the experience rather than something that stands outside of it, like a character that emerges within a story rather than the author of the story itself. There is also a very simple way to notice this in everyday life. Think about the last time you were speaking naturally, without planning your words, perhaps in a relaxed conversation with a friend, or even speaking out loud to yourself. Words came out, one after another. You did not carefully choose each one. You didn't construct each sentence step by step. They simply appeared. And only after they appeared did they feel like your words. This suggests something subtle. The process of thinking may happen first, and the sense of I am the one doing this may come slightly later, like a gentle echo following the sound. If that is the case, then the self may not be the source of experience. It may be part of the experience, a layer added on top, and if it is a layer, then it is something that can, at least temporarily, become less prominent, not gone, but quieter. And when that happens, what remains? Once again, awareness, still present, still open, still quietly holding everything that appears, but now, without a strong center, without a clear boundary between inside and outside. Just experience as it is. This can feel surprisingly natural when approached gently, not something strange or distant, but something that is already familiar, just rarely noticed. And as we continue, we will move even closer to the edge of this idea, because if awareness can exist without memory, and even without a strong sense of self, then what happens when we explore the possibility of awareness without any content at all? No thoughts, no images, no identity, only awareness itself. As we continue this quiet unfolding, there is one more subtle step we can take. We have already softened memory, we have gently loosened the sense of self, and yet something remains. Experience is still happening. There are still sounds, still sensations, still a sense that something is here. But now something feels different. There is no clear center anymore, no obvious point from which everything is being observed. And this brings us to a very unusual idea, a kind of perspective without a person. At first, this may sound almost impossible, because we're so used to thinking that every experience must belong to someone, that there must be a viewer watching the scene. But what if the experience itself does not actually require a viewer? What if what we call a point of view is not a fixed point at all, but simply a structure within experience? Let's approach this gently. Imagine a camera placed in a quiet room. It records everything in front of it. Light enters the lens, images are formed, movement is captured, but there is no one behind the camera, no one interpreting, no one claiming ownership. And yet, the recording still happens. In a similar way, experience may unfold, even when the sense of a personal observer becomes very faint, not because something is missing, but because the idea of a central observer may not be as necessary as it seems. Another way to sense this is through a very simple shift in language. Instead of saying, "I am seeing the room," try noticing, "There is seeing," instead of, "I am hearing a sound." notice. There is hearing. At first, this might feel like a small change, but if you stay with it, something subtle begins to open. The experience is still there, clear, immediate, present, but the feeling that it belongs to someone begins to soften. It becomes less about who is experiencing and more about the fact that experience is simply occurring. This is sometimes described in very careful terms as a kind of perspective without a person, not a first-person view, where everything is centered around me, not a third-person view, where you're observing from the outside, but something in between, or perhaps beyond both, a kind of open presence, where experience appears without a defined owner. Now, this does not mean that there is no structure at all. There may still be a sense of orientation, a feeling that experience is happening here rather than there. But this here is not clearly tied to a person. It is simply a feature of how experience is organized, like the center of a circle that exists as part of the shape, even though it is not a physical object. This idea can feel quite abstract when described in words, but in practice, it can appear in very familiar situations. For example, think about a moment when you were completely absorbed in something simple, perhaps watching the rain fall outside a window, not thinking about it, not analyzing it, just watching. In that moment, there may have been very little sense of I am watching. There was just the movement of the rain, the sound, the quiet rhythm. The experience felt whole, complete, without needing to be centered around a self. Or consider a moment of deep listening, when someone is speaking and you are fully present, not preparing your response, not thinking ahead, just listening. For a brief time, the usual sense of me fades into the background. There's just the sound of the voice, the meaning unfolding, the presence of the moment. And yet, awareness remains, clear, open, undisturbed. These moments are often overlooked because they feel so ordinary, but they offer a glimpse into something deeper. They suggest that awareness does not need a strong sense of identity to function. It does not require a narrator or a central controller. It can exist as a kind of open field where experiences arise and pass. There is also something quietly relieving about this. If there is no fixed center, no permanent observer that must manage everything, then perhaps there is less effort required to simply be, less need to control every thought, less need to hold everything together. Experience can unfold on its own, supported by awareness, without needing constant intervention. Of course, in daily life, the sense of self usually returns. It is useful. It helps us navigate the world. It gives structure to our actions and decisions. But it may not be the foundation. It may be something that appears within a deeper layer of awareness, and that deeper layer may not belong to anyone in particular. It is simply there. This brings us gently to a very interesting boundary. If awareness can exist without a clear self and without a defined observer, then what remains if we go even further? If we allow not only the sense of who, but also the content itself to become very quiet. No images, no thoughts, no sensations that stand out. Would awareness still remain, even then? Or would everything dissolve into complete stillness, with nothing left to notice at all? As we move closer to that question, the experience becomes more subtle, more difficult to describe, and yet, perhaps closer than we think. As we move a little further, past the soft edges of memory, past the quiet fading of the self, we arrive at a place that feels almost impossible to imagine clearly. A state where there is no content, no thoughts, no images, no inner voice quietly speaking in the background, and yet not nothing, not the absence of experience, but something more subtle, a kind of awareness without anything appearing inside it. At first, this might sound like a contradiction, because we usually think of experience as something that must contain things, something to see, something to hear, something to think about. But here, we are gently exploring the possibility that awareness itself might not depend on any of those, that it could exist even when there is nothing in particular to be aware of. To approach this, it helps to stay very close to simple images. Imagine an empty room, not dark, not filled with objects, just open. Now imagine that the room is softly filled with light, not a harsh light, not a spotlight, just a quiet, even glow. There are no shadows, no shapes to focus on, nothing drawing your attention in any direction. And yet, the room is not empty in the sense of being absent, it is filled with light. In a similar way, this state of pure awareness is often described as empty, but not blank, clear, but not dark, present, but without content. There is no thought saying, "This is happening." No image forming in the mind, no sense of time passing in the usual way. And yet, there is still a kind of wakefulness, a gentle sense that something is on, like a light that remains quietly illuminated, even when no one is moving in the room. This idea may feel distant at first, but there are moments in everyday life that come surprisingly close. For example, just as you're about to fall asleep, there is often a brief period where thoughts begin to fade. Images lose their clarity. The usual sense of "I am thinking" becomes very soft, and for a moment, there is just a kind of quiet presence, not fully asleep, not actively thinking, just there. Or consider the very early moment of waking, before any thought has formed, before memory returns, before identity gathers itself. There can be a brief openness, a kind of silent awareness, without anything inside it. These moments are usually very short. They pass quickly, almost unnoticed, but they suggest something important. That awareness does not always need content. It can exist, even when nothing specific is appearing within it. Now, there is a subtle detail here. When we say no content, it does not mean that absolutely nothing is happening. It means that there is nothing that stands out as an object. No distinct thought, no clear image, no defined sensation. Experience becomes smooth, continuous, like a calm surface of water, without ripples. There is no separation between this and that, no clear boundary between observer and observed, just a kind of undivided presence. And because there is nothing to focus on, attention itself becomes very soft. It does not move from one thing to another. It does not search or select. It simply rests. This is very different from our usual way of experiencing the world. Most of the time, attention is active. It jumps, it chooses, it follows one thought, then another. But here, there is nowhere to go, nothing to follow, and so attention becomes still. There's also no sense of effort, no sense of trying to hold on to anything under you or push anything away, because there is nothing to hold and nothing to resist. Everything that usually creates movement in the mind has become quiet, and what remains is something very simple, so simple that it can feel almost like nothing at all, but not quite nothing, more like the possibility of experience itself, a kind of open capacity, a quiet readiness for anything to appear. And yet, in this moment, nothing does. This is why some people describe it as empty, but it may be more accurate to think of it as open. Open without being filled, present, without being defined. There is also something gently peaceful about this state, not because it is trying to be peaceful, but because there is nothing creating disturbance, no thought pulling in one direction, no emotion creating tension, no identity trying to maintain itself, just stillness. And within that stillness, awareness remains, not doing anything, not going anywhere, just being. Now, this raises a very quiet question. If awareness can exist in this way, without content, without self, without movement, then what exactly is it? Is it something the brain produces? Is it something more fundamental? Or is it simply a word we use to point toward this very simple presence? We don't need to answer that just yet, because as soon as we try to define it too clearly, something begins to change. The moment we think about it, thoughts return. The moment we try to describe it, language appears, and suddenly the quiet openness is filled again, which leads us gently to the next step in our exploration. Because there is something very interesting about this state, something that makes it difficult to hold on to, and even more difficult to describe, not because it is far away, but because the act of describing it seems to transform it, like trying to speak about silence while making sound. And as we continue, we'll begin to explore why that happens and what it reveals about the nature of experience itself. As we stay with this quiet idea of awareness without content, something curious begins to reveal itself, not in the experience itself, but in what happens when we try to talk about it. Because the moment we begin to describe this state, it seems to change, gently but noticeably. It's almost as if the act of describing it fills it, like pouring water into an empty glass. Before, there was just openness. Now, there is something inside. Words, concepts, images forming in the mind. And the simple, quiet awareness we were pointing toward becomes something else. Something more familiar, but also more complex. This is why people often say that this kind of experience is difficult to describe, not because it is mysterious in a distant way, but because it is too simple. So simple that language struggles to hold it. To see this more clearly, imagine trying to describe silence. Not just the absence of loud noise, but a deep, complete silence. You begin to speak about it. You say, it's very quiet, very still, but in the very moment you speak, the silence is broken. Your words replace the thing you're trying to describe, and what remains is not silence itself, but a description of it, a memory of it. Something similar happens here. When awareness is free of content, it does not contain words, it does not describe itself, it simply is. But the moment we try to think about it, thoughts appear, and those thoughts become the new content of experience. So instead of awareness without content, we now have awareness of thoughts, and the original state becomes something we can only remember, not directly experience while describing it. There is a gentle paradox here. To know it directly, you must not be describing it. But to explain it to someone else, you must use words. And in using words, you move away from it. This is why descriptions of this state often feel indirect. They point towards something rather than capturing it. They use metaphors, images, small hints, because there is no simple sentence that can fully contain it. It's a bit like trying to describe the taste of water. You can say it is clear, refreshing, neutral. But none of those words truly convey what it is like. The only way to know it is to experience it directly, and even then, the moment you try to explain it, you are no longer in the pure experience, you are remembering it, reconstructing it. This brings us to another subtle point. What we often report about our experiences is not the experience itself, it is a version of it, shaped by memory. When you say, "I experienced a quiet awareness," you are describing something that has already passed. You are using thoughts, language, and memory to recreate it, and in doing so, you inevitably add something to it. You give it form, you give it structure, you give it meaning, but the original experience may not have had those features. It may have been much simpler, much quieter, without labels, without interpretation. This is sometimes described as a kind of immediate experience versus a remembered experience. The immediate experience is what happens in the moment, before thought steps in. The remembered experience is what we can talk about afterward, and the two are not exactly the same. This is not a problem. It is simply how the mind works. Memory helps us make sense of what has happened. It organizes, connects, explains. But in doing so, it changes things slightly. It turns something simple into something that can be described. And in the case of pure awareness, this change is especially noticeable because the original state has so little structure, so little content, that even a small addition can feel like a big difference. A single thought is enough to shift it. A single word is enough to move away from it. This is why people sometimes say that this kind of awareness is always just beyond the reach of language, not because it is hidden, but because language itself introduces content, and content is exactly what is absent in that state. There is also something quietly beautiful about this. It means that awareness does not need to explain itself. It does not need to be understood in words to exist. It is already complete as it is. Even if we cannot fully describe it, we can still recognize it. In small moments, in the pause between thoughts, in the stillness before sleep, in the brief silence after a sound fades. These are not perfect examples, but they point in the right direction. They remind us that awareness is not something we have to create. It is something we can notice when everything else becomes quiet. And as we continue, this leads us to an even more intriguing question. If this state cannot be described without changing it, and if our reports about it are always shaped by memory, then what does it mean to say, "I experienced a state with no self, no thoughts, no content"? Is that statement truly accurate? Or is it something that only appears after the fact, reconstructed by the mind? This is where the puzzle becomes a little deeper, not in a difficult way, but in a gently surprising way, because it invites us to look not only at experience itself, but at how we talk about experience. And as we move forward, we will explore this quiet tension and what it reveals about the nature of awareness. As we continue, gently holding this idea that some experiences are too simple to describe, another quiet question begins to emerge. A question that feels almost like a riddle, but not one that needs solving, more like something to be noticed slowly. If there is a state with no thoughts, no images, to no sense of self, then how can we ever say that we experienced it? Because the moment we say, "I experienced it," something seems to shift. There is suddenly an I, there is a memory, there is a description, and yet the state we are pointing to is supposed to have none of these. No self, no narrative, no content. So how can both be true at the same time? This is a very gentle kind of paradox, not a sharp contradiction, but a soft tension between two ways of looking at the same thing. On one side, there is the experience itself, quiet, simple, without structure. On the other side, there is the report, the words we use afterward, the memory we form, the story we tell about what happened, and these two are not quite the same. Imagine for a moment that you're sitting by a still lake at night. The surface is perfectly calm, no ripples, no movement. The water reflects the sky so clearly that it feels almost like there is no boundary between them. Now imagine that you gently touch the surface, just a small movement. Immediately, ripples begin to spread. The reflection changes. The stillness is no longer the same. Trying to describe a state of pure awareness is a little like touching that surface. The description creates ripples, it introduces movement, and what you are left with is not the original stillness, but a changed version of it. So when someone says, "I experienced a state with no self," what they are really describing is not the state itself, but the memory of it. A memory that was formed after the experience ended. A memory that includes things the original state may not have had. Words, structure, a sense of I. This does not mean the experience is false. It simply means that our way of reporting it adds something to it. Like adding a frame around a painting. The frame helps us see it, but it is not part of the painting itself. There is also something interesting about how quickly this happens. The moment awareness shifts back into thought, the mind begins to organize what just occurred. It asks, what was that? What did I experience? How can I describe it? And in answering these questions, it builds a narrative, a story. But that story is already one step removed from the original moment. It is like looking at a photograph of a place, rather than standing in the place itself. The photograph may be accurate, but it is not the same as being there. This is why descriptions of these experiences often feel slightly paradoxical. They say things like, there was awareness, but no one was aware. There was experience, but nothing was experienced. At first, these statements can sound confusing, but if we hold them gently, they begin to make a kind of quiet sense. They are trying to point to a situation where awareness exists, without the usual structure that defines it. No subject, no object, no clear separation between the two, just presence. And then, afterward, the mind returns, and with it comes the structure. The subject appears, the memory forms, the language begins, and only then can we say, I experienced something. But by that point, the original simplicity has already shifted. This also helps explain why different people describe these experiences in slightly different ways, because each description is shaped by the person's language, their background, their expectations. The core experience may be very simple, even similar across people, but the way it is remembered and described can vary. Some may call it silence, some may call it emptiness, some may call it clarity. These are all attempts to point toward the same quiet presence. None of them are perfect, but each offers a small window. There is also a gentle lesson here. When we explore something as subtle as pure awareness, it may not be helpful to look for perfect descriptions or exact definitions. Instead, it may be more useful to treat these ideas as pointers, soft directions, guiding attention towards something that cannot be fully captured in words, like a sign pointing toward a distant place. The sign is not the destination, but it helps you move in the right direction, and in this case, the direction is inward, toward the simple fact of being aware, without needing to define it too precisely, without needing to hold on to it, just noticing that it is there, even now. And as we continue, we will gently shift from this quiet paradox back towards something more familiar, because these ideas, as subtle as they are not separate from everyday life. They are quietly present, in ordinary moments, often without being noticed. In the next part of our journey, we will begin to explore those moments, these small, simple situations where the sense of self fades, where thoughts arise on their own, and where awareness continues quietly in the background, not as something distant or abstract, but as something already woven into the fabric of daily experience. After resting for a while at the quiet edge of experience, where things become simple, almost empty, it can feel natural to return gently to something more familiar, not to leave that simplicity behind, but to notice how it quietly exists, even within ordinary moments. Because the ideas we've explored so far are not only found in stillness or in rare, unusual states, they are present in everyday life, sometimes in very subtle ways, and one of the simplest places to notice this is in the way thoughts appear. At first glance, thinking feels like something we do. I am thinking. I choose what to think. I decide what comes next. But if you slow down just a little and watch carefully, something surprising begins to show itself. Thoughts do not always feel chosen. They seem to arrive, one after another, sometimes gently, sometimes quickly, but often without any clear decision. You can explore this in a very simple way. Let your mind rest for a moment. No need to force anything. Just wait quietly. And then, notice the next thought that appears. You might find that you did not plan it. You did not select it from a list. It simply came. Perhaps it was a word, or an image, or a small idea, but it appeared on its own. And if you ask yourself, what will my next thought be? You may notice something interesting you don't quite know. You can guess, you can try to guide it, but the exact moment, the exact content remains uncertain, and then, suddenly, it appears, already formed, already present. This has a very gentle implication. It suggests that thoughts may not be fully under our control. They arise within awareness, and only afterward do they feel like my thoughts. It's a bit like hearing a sound. If a bird sings outside your window, the sound appears in your experience. You do not create it, you simply hear it. In a similar way, thoughts may be something we become aware of, rather than something we deliberately produce. Of course, we can influence thinking, we can guide it, focus it, shape it over time. But the immediate appearance of a thought often feels spontaneous, unplanned. This can be seen very clearly in everyday situations. For example, when you are speaking naturally, perhaps in a relaxed conversation, with no script, no preparation. Words come out, one after another. You're not assembling each sentence piece by piece. You're not selecting each word from a list. Instead, the words seem to flow, as if they are being formed, just ahead of your awareness, and only as they are spoken do they feel like your words. Or consider moments when your mind wanders. You may be sitting quietly, not focusing on anything in particular, and suddenly a thought appears about something from the past, or a random idea, or a memory you had not been thinking about at all. It arrives without being called, like a visitor appearing at the door without knocking. This does not mean that thoughts are completely separate from you, but it does suggest that the relationship between you and your thoughts may be different from what it first seems. Rather than being the creator of each thought, you may be more like the space in which thoughts appear, a quiet field where ideas come and go, some staying longer, some passing quickly. And this connects gently with what we explored earlier. If awareness is like an open space, then thoughts are like movements within that space. They do not define the space itself. They simply occur within it. This also helps explain something else, why it can be difficult to stop thinking just by deciding to. If thoughts were entirely under direct control, you could simply choose to stop. But often, even when you try to quiet the mind, thoughts continue to appear, perhaps more slowly, perhaps more softly, but still, they come. This suggests that thinking is not a single central process, but something more distributed, more like a natural activity of the mind, rather than a fully controlled action. And yet, throughout all of this, awareness remains. It does not need to produce the thoughts. It does not need to manage them. It simply notices, like the sky, allowing clouds to pass. Some clouds are light and fleeting, others are heavy and slow, but the sky itself remains unchanged. In the same way, awareness does not need to hold on to thoughts or push them away. It allows them to appear and disappear on their own. There is also something quietly freeing in this observation. If thoughts arise naturally, without needing to be created, then perhaps we do not need to take each one so personally. A thought appears. It does not mean it defines you. It does not mean you chose it. It is simply something that happened within awareness, and just as it appeared, it can pass. This does not remove responsibility from our actions, but it softens the idea that every thought is something we must identify with. It creates a little space, a little distance between awareness and the content that appears within it. And in that space, something becomes clearer. Awareness itself is still present, unmoved by the specific thoughts that come and go, quietly holding them without needing to become them. And as we continue, we will begin to notice how this plays out in other familiar situations, moments where the sense of self fades into the background, where experience flows without effort, and where awareness continues quietly without needing to be in control. As we begin to notice how thoughts can appear on their own, quietly forming and dissolving, within awareness, there is another kind of experience that brings this idea into sharper focus, not by removing thoughts entirely, but by changing how they relate to the sense of self. These are the moments when you feel completely absorbed, when you're doing something, and yet, somehow, you're not thinking about yourself doing it. Moments when everything seems to flow. You may have experienced this while listening to music, not just hearing it in the background, but being fully drawn into it. The rhythm carries you. The melody unfolds. Each note follows the last in a way that feels natural, effortless. And for a while, there is no inner voice saying, "I'm listening to music." There is just the music, clear, immediate, present, or perhaps during a conversation. Not one where you're carefully choosing your words or worrying about what to say next, but one that moves easily. Words come without effort, responses arise naturally. There is a sense of connection, of being fully engaged. And in that engagement, the usual sense of me becomes very quiet. You're not stepping back to observe yourself. You're simply there, speaking, listening, responding, without needing to think about it. This kind of experience is often called flow, but we don't need the term itself. We can simply notice the feeling, a sense of ease, a lack of effort, a quiet fading of self-awareness. And what is interesting is that awareness does not disappear in these moments. In fact, it often feels clearer, more direct, more alive. It is not clouded by constant reflection or inner commentary. It is simply present with what is happening. This gives us an important clue. The sense of self is not required for awareness to function. It can step back, soften, even fade, while awareness continues. In fact, sometimes awareness feels more vivid when the self is less involved, because there is less interference, less filtering, less need to evaluate or control. It's a bit like looking at a landscape through a window. If the glass is covered with marks, reflections, or distortions, the view becomes less clear. But if the glass is clean, transparent, the scene appears more directly. In this analogy, the constant sense of self, the inner commentary, the evaluation of experience, can act like those marks on the glass, not harmful, but adding an extra layer. And when that layer softens, experience can feel more immediate, more open. Now, there is another subtle detail here. In these moments of flow, thinking doesn't stop completely. Thoughts may still appear, but they are not being closely examined. They are not being claimed. They are not being turned into a story. They simply pass through as part of the activity. Like background music, that does not demand attention. And because of this, the boundary between thought and action becomes less noticeable. You do not feel like you are thinking about what to do. You simply do it. Movement happens, words happen, responses happen, without a strong sense of a central controller. This can feel surprisingly natural, almost familiar, as if, for a moment, the usual effort of maintaining a self has been set aside, and what remains is a kind of seamless experience, where awareness and activity are not separate, just one continuous flow. There is also something quietly peaceful in this, not because everything is perfect, but because there is less resistance, less need to monitor every detail, less concern about how things are unfolding. Things simply unfold. And awareness is there, quietly accompanying them. This does not mean that the self disappears completely. It may still be present, in a very soft way, but it is not at the center. It is not directing every movement. It is more like a faint outline, rather than a solid structure. And this helps us see something important. The sense of self is flexible. It can become strong when needed, focused when required, but it can also become light, almost transparent when conditions allow. And in those moments, awareness remains steady, unbroken, unaffected by the presence or absence of a strong identity. This also connects gently to what we explored earlier. If awareness can exist without a strong sense of self, and if thoughts can arise without being fully controlled, then perhaps consciousness is not centered around a single doer, not a fixed entity that creates every experience, but something more like an open process, a field where things happen, where thoughts appear, where actions unfold, where experiences arise and pass. And the sense of I may be something that joins in, rather than something that begins everything. This idea does not need to be forced. It can simply be noticed in small moments. When you're absorbed in music, when you're walking without thinking about each step, when you are speaking and the words come naturally. In those moments, you are still fully present, fully aware, but not centered around a strong sense of self. And this brings us gently to another kind of experience. Moments that are not smooth, not flowing, but still reveal something similar. Moments when the sense of self disappears, not because everything is easy, but because something unexpected happens, something that briefly interrupts the usual structure of experience, and in that interruption, something very simple becomes visible. As we've gently explored moments of flow, where the sense of self softens in ease and movement, There is another kind of experience that reveals something similar, but in a very different way, not through smoothness, but through interruption. Moments when something unexpected happens, and for a brief instant, the usual sense of you is not there. You may have noticed this when waking up suddenly in the middle of the night. The room is dark, the world is quiet, and for a second or two, there is a strange feeling. You're aware, but not yet oriented. You don't immediately know where you are. You don't remember what day it is. Your name has not yet returned. There is awareness, but no clear identity. Just a kind of open presence without a story. Then slowly, things begin to come back. This is my room. I'm at home. It's nighttime. And with those thoughts, the sense of self reassembles itself, like pieces of a puzzle falling back into place. But that first moment, before everything returns, is very revealing, because it shows that awareness can exist, even when identity is temporarily absent. Another example can appear in moments of sudden surprise, a loud sound, an unexpected movement. For a brief instant, there is no time to think, no time to form a narrative. There's only a direct, immediate experience, a flash of awareness, clear, undivided, and only afterward does the mind catch up. What was that? Where did it come from? Thoughts rush in, organizing the experience, placing it into a familiar structure. But the initial moment is different. It is simple, almost raw. There is also a more subtle version of this that can happen during transitions. For example, when you wake up from a dream, but haven't yet fully entered waking life, you may still feel the remnants of the dream, but they are fading. Your waking identity has not fully returned, and for a short time, you are somewhere in between. Not fully the person you are during the day, but not completely immersed in the dream either. Just aware, without a clear sense of who that awareness belongs to. These moments can feel slightly disorienting, but also strangely peaceful, because there is no pressure to be anyone, no role to play, no identity to maintain. Just the simple fact of being aware. It's easy to overlook these experiences. They are brief, they do not feel important, they pass quickly, but they offer a glimpse into something deeper. They show that the sense of self is not always present. It can disappear, even if only for a moment, and yet awareness continues. This suggests that the self is not the foundation of consciousness. It is something that can appear and disappear within it. Like a character entering and leaving a stage, the stage remains, whether the character is there or not. There is also something interesting about how quickly the self returns, almost automatically. As soon as the mind begins to organize experience, identity reappears. This is happening to me. I am here. It feels natural, effortless. But if we look closely, we can see that it is a process, a reconstruction. The mind gathers pieces, memory, context, familiar patterns, and from these, it rebuilds the sense of self. This happens so quickly that it usually feels instantaneous, but in those brief moments before it completes, we can catch a glimpse of something else, a kind of awareness, without ownership, without a center, just presence. These glimpses are not limited to unusual situations. They can happen in very ordinary moments. For example, when you're deeply relaxed and your mind becomes quiet, there may be a brief pause where nothing stands out, no strong thoughts, no clear sense of I, just a gentle awareness, resting. Or when you are staring into space, not focused on anything in particular. For a moment, the usual narrative pauses, and there is simply seeing, without interpretation, without ownership. These moments are often dismissed, seen as unimportant, or even as lapses in attention. But they may actually be small windows, openings into a more fundamental layer of experience, a layer where awareness exists, without needing to define itself, without needing to belong to someone. This does not mean that the self is unnecessary. It plays an important role in daily life. It helps us navigate the world, make decisions, maintain continuity. But it may not be the starting point. It may be something that emerges within awareness, rather than something that creates it. And this leads us gently toward a new perspective. Instead of thinking, I am aware, we might begin to consider, awareness is here, and sometimes the sense of I appears within it. Not always, not continuously, but often enough that it feels constant, until we begin to notice the moments when it is not. And as we continue, we will take this understanding a step further, because if awareness can exist without memory, without a strong sense of self, and even without clear content, then what might be happening in the brain when this occurs? Not as a final answer, but as a gentle exploration, a way of connecting these quiet experiences with the deeper processes that support them, /greater than. As we gently move from these quiet moments of experience into a softer understanding of what may be happening beneath them, it can help to begin with something very simple. The idea that what you experience is not the world exactly as it is, but a version of it, a kind of inner picture, quietly constructed by the brain, not deliberately, not consciously, but continuously, moment by moment. Imagine for a moment that you're sitting inside a calm, dimly lit room. In front of you, there is a screen. On that screen, images appear. Sounds are matched to those images. Movement flows smoothly. It feels real. But what you're seeing is not the world itself. It is a representation, a carefully assembled display, built from signals. Now, this may sound like something distant or abstract, but in a very real sense, this is similar to how your experience works. Light enters your eyes, tiny vibrations reach your ears, signals travel through the body, and somewhere within the brain, the signals are organized, interpreted, and turned into a coherent experience. But here is the subtle part. The brain does not simply wait for information and then react. It is constantly, quietly, making predictions, gently anticipating what is about to happen next, like a musician who knows the rhythm of a song and can feel where the next note will fall, even before it is played. Your brain is doing something similar. It builds a kind of expectation, a soft guess about what the world will be like in the next moment, and then it compares that expectation with what actually arrives. If the guess is close enough, everything feels smooth, continuous, seamless. You don't notice the process at all. But if something unexpected happens, a sudden sound, a surprising movement, the difference becomes noticeable, and your experience adjusts. Now, instead of thinking of perception as something passive, like receiving a photograph, you can think of it as something more active, more like a quiet conversation. The brain offers a prediction, the world responds, and the two are gently brought into alignment. This process happens so quickly and so effortlessly that it feels like you're simply seeing reality as it is. But what you're actually experiencing is a model, a simplified version, a useful representation built to help you navigate the world. It's a bit like the dashboard of a car. When you drive, you don't see the engine directly. You don't observe the combustion, the moving parts, the internal mechanisms. Instead, you see indicators, speed, fuel level, temperature. These are not the engine itself. They are a model, a way of presenting just enough information to guide your actions. In the same way, your experience of the world, the colours you see, the sounds you hear, the feeling of being in a space, may be more like a dashboard than a direct window into reality. This does not make it false. It makes it functional. It is designed to be useful, not to show everything exactly as it is. Now here is where this connects to our earlier exploration. If the brain is constantly building this model, then the sense of self may also be part of that construction, a feature within the model, a way of organizing experience, not necessarily the source of everything, but something that appears within the system. And just like other parts of the model, it can change. It can become stronger or weaker, depending on the situation. This helps explain why, in certain moments, the sense of self can fade, not because something is broken, but because the brain is no longer emphasizing that part of the model. In moments of flow, in deep stillness, in those brief transitions we explored earlier, the model becomes simpler, less detailed, less centered around a someone, and what remains is the basic structure of experience, awareness, without the usual layers. There's also something quietly elegant about this. The brain is not trying to show you everything. It is trying to show you what is needed, what is helpful, and sometimes what is helpful is less rather than more. A simpler model, a quieter experience. Now, this does not mean that awareness itself is just a model. That is a deeper question, one we don't need to answer here. But it does suggest that many of the things we associate with consciousness, the richness, the detail, the sense of identity, may be additions, layers built on top of something more basic. And when those layers soften, what we are left with is something closer to the foundation, a kind of awareness that does not depend on the full complexity of the model, a presence that remains even when the display becomes very simple. And as we continue, we can look even deeper, because beneath this constantly shifting model, there may be something even more fundamental, something that does not create images or thoughts, but simply keeps the entire system awake, like a quiet signal that allows everything else to appear. As we continue, gently moving beneath the surface of experience, we arrive at something even more subtle. Not the images your mind creates, not the thoughts that appear and disappear, not even the sense of being a person within it all, but something quieter, something that seems to come first, the simple fact that you are awake. Before any thought forms, before any image appears, there is a kind of background condition, a soft onness, a quiet sense that the system is active. You may notice this most clearly in the difference between being asleep and being awake. When you are deeply asleep, without dreams, there's no experience that you can point to, no thoughts, no images, no sense of time passing. And then, at some point, something shifts, not dramatically, not with a clear signal, but suddenly you are aware again, even before you remember anything, even before you recognize where you are. There is a simple sense of being awake. It's not something you usually think about, because it feels so basic, so constant. But if you pause for a moment, you might begin to notice it. Right now, there's a quiet feeling of being on, not busy, not active in a strong way, just awake. This background wakefulness is supported by parts of the brain that operate very deep beneath conscious thought, very old structures that have been part of the brain for a long time, They do not create detailed images. They do not produce complex ideas. Instead, they help maintain a simple condition. That experience can happen at all. You might think of it like a light in a room. Before anything can be seen, the light must be on. The furniture may change, the objects may move, people may come and go, but none of it can be seen unless there is light. In the same way, this deep underlying activity in the brain helps keep awareness possible. Not shaping its content, but allowing it to exist. And what is interesting is that this light can remain even when everything else becomes very quiet, when thoughts fade, when images disappear, when the sense of self softens. The light may still be on, gently, steadily, without drawing attention to itself. This gives us another clue. Awareness may not depend entirely on the complex parts of the brain that handle thinking, memory, or identity. It may be supported, at least in part, by something more basic, a kind of underlying activation, a quiet signal that keeps the system ready for experience, even if nothing specific is appearing. This can help explain some of the states we explored earlier, moments of pure awareness, without content, moments where there are no thoughts, no clear sense of self, and yet something remains. That something may be this underlying wakefulness, not rich, not detailed, but present, like a room where the light is on, even though nothing is happening inside. There is also something comforting in this idea, because it suggests that awareness is not something fragile, not something that needs constant effort to maintain. It is supported quietly by deeper processes that continue even when we're not paying attention, even when we are resting, even when we're not thinking at all. Of course, the full experience of being awake, with thoughts, perception, and identity, depends on many different parts of the brain working together. But this basic level, this simple on-ness, may be closer to the foundation, a starting point, rather than the full picture. And this raises a gentle question. If this underlying signal can exist on its own, if awareness can remain, even when content fades, then what happens during the deepest forms of rest, when the mind is completely quiet, when there are no dreams, no images, no thoughts? Does this background awareness disappear entirely, or could it still remain in some very subtle form? This question brings us to one of the most intriguing possibilities in the study of consciousness, the idea that even in the deepest sleep, there may be a kind of awareness, quietly present, without content, without memory, a silent presence that leaves almost no trace, but is not entirely absent. And as we continue, we will gently explore this possibility, not as a fixed conclusion, but as a quiet invitation to look more closely at what it means to be aware, even in the absence of everything else. As we continue, moving gently into quieter and quieter layers of experience, we arrive at a question that feels both simple and surprisingly difficult to answer. What happens to awareness when you are deeply asleep, not dreaming, not thinking, not experiencing images or sounds, just deep sleep? From the outside, it often seems like nothing is there. No movement, no response, no sign of inner activity that we can easily observe. And when you wake up, there is often no memory of what happened during that time. It can feel as if the night simply disappeared, as if awareness turned off and then turned back on again in the morning. But if we look a little more carefully, the picture becomes less certain, because the absence of memory does not always mean the absence of experience. It simply means that nothing was recorded in a way that can be recalled later. There are many things that happen in life that we do not remember, moments that pass without leaving a trace in memory, and yet they still occurred. So the question becomes a little more subtle. Is it possible that during deep sleep, there is still a very simple form of awareness, even if we do not remember it? Not a detailed experience, not a dream, but something more like a quiet presence, without content. Some people describe waking up from deep sleep with a feeling that is difficult to put into words, a sense that time has passed, but not in the usual way, not as a sequence of events, more like a smooth transition, as if the night was not filled with experiences, but also not entirely empty. There was no story, but perhaps something remained. This idea has been explored in different ways, both scientifically and through careful observation of experience. And while it is not something that can be easily measured or confirmed, there are hints that suggest awareness may not completely disappear, even in the deepest rest. To approach this gently, imagine a room once again. Earlier we imagined a room filled with light, but without objects. Now imagine something slightly different. The room is completely still. No movement, no sound, no activity. But the light is still on. Nothing is happening. And yet, the condition for seeing remains. Now imagine that there are no objects in the room at all. No furniture, no shapes, nothing to look at. If you were inside that room, there would be nothing to focus on, nothing to remember. And afterward, you might say, there was nothing there. But strictly speaking, the room was not absent. The light was still on. In a similar way, deep sleep may be a state where there is no content, no thoughts, no images, no sense of self, but the underlying condition, the possibility of awareness, may still be present, quietly, without leaving a clear trace. This would explain why the transition from sleep to waking can sometimes feel so smooth, as if awareness did not suddenly appear, but simply became more active, more filled, more structured, rather than being created from nothing. It also connects with the idea we explored earlier, that awareness does not always need content. It does not always need something to be aware of. It may be able to exist in a very simple form, even when nothing is happening. Of course, this is a delicate idea, because it is very easy to assume that if we do not remember something, it did not occur. But memory is only one part of experience. It is what allows us to look back, to describe, to build a narrative. Without memory, there is no story. But that does not necessarily mean there was no presence. There is also something quietly reassuring in this possibility. The idea that awareness is not something that switches on and off, like a light controlled by a button, but something more continuous, something that can become very quiet, very simple, but not entirely absent, like a soft glow that remains even when everything else fades. This does not mean that we are aware in the same way during deep sleep as we are now. The richness, the detail, the sense of being a person, all of that may be absent, but the most basic layer, the simple condition of awareness, may still be there in a form that is difficult to notice and even more difficult to remember. And this brings us gently to an important realization. If awareness can exist without thoughts, without memory, without a strong sense of self, without content, then perhaps it is much simpler than we usually imagine. Not something built from many complex parts, but something that remains, even when those parts fall away. And as we continue, we will explore this idea more directly, not by adding more explanations, but by noticing how simple awareness may already be, when everything else becomes quiet. As we arrive here, after gently moving through layers of experience, something begins to feel quietly different. Not because we have added more ideas, but because we have taken many of them away. We have seen that awareness can remain without strong thoughts, without memory, without a clear sense of self, even perhaps without content. And when all of these layers soften, what is left does not feel complex. It feels simple, so simple that it can be easy to overlook, because we are used to associating consciousness with richness, with detail, with meaning, with the constant movement of thoughts and emotions. We imagine it as something intricate, something built from many interacting parts, and in many ways that is true when we look at the full picture. The brain is complex, the processes that support perception and thought are intricate, but the experience itself, the feeling of being aware, may not be complex at all. It may be closer to something very direct, very immediate, like clear water. Imagine holding a glass of water in your hands. The water itself is simple, transparent, without structure, without decoration, and yet it can take on many forms. It can reflect light, it can carry ripples, it can contain objects. The complexity we see often comes from what is added to it, not from the water itself. In a similar way, awareness may be like that, simple in its nature, but capable of holding very complex experiences. Thoughts, memories, perceptions, all of these can appear within awareness, giving it the impression of complexity. But when those elements settle, when the surface becomes still, what remains is something very clear, very quiet, very simple. There is also an interesting contrast here. When scientists and philosophers try to explain consciousness, the explanations can become quite detailed. They involve brain activity, information processing, interactions between different regions. The descriptions can be layered, technical, and sometimes difficult to follow, and yet the experience they are trying to explain is something you already know, not as a theory, but directly. You are aware, right now. You do not need a complex explanation to recognize that. It is immediate, obvious, in a quiet way. This creates a gentle contrast. The explanation may be complex, but the experience itself is not. It is as simple as something is present, something is being experienced, and that is all. There is also something quietly humbling in this. We can build very detailed models to understand how consciousness might arise, but the thing itself remains simple, not because it lacks depth, but because it does not need to be complicated to exist. It is already complete in its simplest form. This simplicity can sometimes feel surprising, because we are used to searching for answers in complexity. We look for mechanisms, structures, systems, and those are important. But when it comes to experience itself, there may be a point where adding more detail does not bring us closer. Instead, it may move us further away from what is already present. It's a bit like trying to understand the taste of water by analysing its composition. You can describe it in terms of elements, interactions, molecular structure, and all of that is accurate, but none of it replaces the direct experience of tasting it. In the same way, understanding consciousness in theory is different from noticing it directly, and what we notice directly is often very simple, a kind of open presence, a quiet awareness, not needing to be defined, not needing to be explained, just there. This also connects with something we touched on earlier, the idea that awareness does not need to do anything in order to be present. It does not need to create thoughts. It does not need to maintain identity. It does not need to produce meaning. All of those things can appear within it, but they are not required, and when they are absent, awareness does not disappear. It remains, simple, unchanged. This can feel like a shift in perspective. Instead of seeing consciousness as something built up from many parts, we begin to see it as something that remains when those parts fall away. Not something that needs to be constructed, but something that is already there, beneath the layers. And this realization does not need to be dramatic. It can be very gentle, almost quiet, like noticing something that has always been present, but rarely given attention. And as we continue, this simplicity leads to another subtle insight. If awareness is already complete, in its simplest form, then what, if anything, needs to be added? What is missing? Or is there a possibility that nothing is missing at all? As this quiet sense of simplicity settles in, there is another gentle shift that can begin to take place. Not something dramatic, not a sudden realization, but more like a soft change in how experience feels from the inside. If awareness, in its simplest form, is already present, if it does not depend on adding more thoughts, more identity, more structure, then a quiet question begins to appear. Is there anything missing? Not in a practical sense, not in terms of daily life, but in this immediate moment of being aware. If you pause just for a second and notice your experience as it is, without trying to change it, without trying to improve it, without reaching for anything, there may be a brief sense that nothing needs to be added. Everything that is here is already here. The sounds, the sensations, the quiet background of awareness. Nothing is incomplete. Nothing is waiting to be finished. It is simply this moment. This may feel unfamiliar at first, because much of our thinking is oriented toward doing, toward improving, adjusting, moving forward. We're used to asking, what should I do next? What needs to be fixed? What is missing? And these questions are useful. They help us navigate the world. They help us grow, adapt, respond to challenges. But in the very immediate sense of awareness itself, there may be moments when none of those questions are necessary. Not because they are wrong, but because for a brief time, they are not needed. Experience is already happening. Awareness is already present. There is nothing that needs to be added in order for that to be true. This does not mean that life has no direction, or that action becomes meaningless. It simply points to a different layer of experience, a layer where awareness is not striving, not reaching, not trying to become something else. It is already complete, in a very quiet way. You can notice this in small moments. Perhaps when you're sitting quietly, with no immediate task, or when you pause in the middle of something and simply take a breath. For a brief instant, there is no movement toward the future, no need to solve anything, just a sense of being here. And in that moment, there may be a kind of ease, not because everything is perfect, but because nothing is being added to the moment, nothing is being demanded from it. This can feel like a kind of rest, not physical rest, but a rest from constant mental movement, a pause, in the tendency to reach for something more. There is also something interesting about how this relates to goals. Much of our thinking is shaped by goals. We imagine a future, and then we move toward it. We plan, we decide, we act. And again, this is useful. But from the perspective of immediate awareness, goals are something that appear within experience. They are thoughts, ideas, directions. They arise like any other thought, and in moments of quiet awareness, Those goal-oriented thoughts may become less prominent. They may fade, just like other content, and what remains is awareness itself, not moving toward anything, not trying to achieve anything, just present. This does not mean that goals disappear entirely. They can return when needed, but it shows that they are not fundamental to awareness. They are additions, features, within the larger field of experience. And when they are not active, awareness does not collapse. It remains simple, steady, unchanged. There is a gentle freedom in recognizing this, because it suggests that awareness does not depend on constant effort. It does not need to be maintained or constructed. It is already there, even when nothing is being done, even when there is no direction, no goal, no plan, just presence. This can feel like a very quiet form of completeness, not a conclusion, not an achievement, but a simple recognition that in this moment, nothing is lacking. And again, this is not something to hold on to, not something to turn into a rule or a belief. It is simply something that can be noticed from time to time, like a brief clearing in a dense forest, a moment where everything opens and there is space, and then, naturally, movement returns, thoughts begin again, plans reappear, the sense of self becomes more defined, and life continues. But perhaps with a slightly different feeling, a sense that beneath all of that movement, there is something simple that does not need to move, something that is already complete before anything is added. And as we come toward the final part of this journey, we can begin to see how this understanding might gently extend beyond individual moments into how we think about ourselves, about others, and about the nature of experience as a whole. As we arrive at this final part of our journey, everything begins to feel a little softer, not because we have reached a conclusion, but because there is less need for one. We have moved through layers of experience, from thoughts to memory to the sense of self, from content to quiet awareness, from complexity to something simple. And now, instead of asking, "What is consciousness?" we might gently ask a different question. What changes when we begin to see it this way, not as something distant or abstract, but as something already present, quietly shaping every moment? If awareness is always there, even in its simplest form, then it is not something rare, not something reserved for special states or unusual experiences. It is something constant, something that accompanies everything you do. When you are thinking, awareness is there. When you're not thinking, awareness is still there. When you feel like yourself, awareness is there. And even in moments when the sense of self fades, awareness remains. This can gently change how we relate to experience, because instead of focusing only on what appears, we begin to notice the space in which it appears. Instead of identifying completely with thoughts, we may begin to see them as something that comes and goes. Instead of holding tightly to identity, we may notice that it is something flexible, something that can soften. This does not remove the practical parts of life. You still make decisions. You still have preferences. You still move through the world as a person. But there may be a quiet shift in the background, a sense that these things are happening within awareness, rather than defining it completely. This perspective can also extend beyond the individual. If awareness is a fundamental part of experience, then understanding it may influence how we think about many things. For example, how we approach learning. Education often focuses on information, facts, skills, knowledge. But if awareness is the foundation of all experience, then learning is not only about what we know, but also about how we experience knowing, a quieter mind, a more open attention, a gentle clarity. These may support learning in ways that are not always emphasized. In a similar way, when we think about technology, especially systems that are designed to process information, there is an ongoing question: can something that processes information also have awareness? And if so, what would that mean? Not as a technical problem alone, but as something that touches on experience itself. What does it mean to be aware? Is it something that can be built or simulated? Or is it something that arises only under certain conditions in ways we do not yet fully understand? These are open questions, quietly unfolding, and they remind us that understanding awareness is not only about looking inward, but also about how we relate to the world around us. There is also a more personal dimension. If awareness is always present, then moments of difficulty, of stress, of confusion are not the whole picture. They are part of the content of experience. They move, they change, they pass. But the awareness in which they appear may remain more stable, more constant. This does not remove challenges, but it may change how they are held. Instead of being completely absorbed by them, there may be a small sense of space, a quiet background that is not overwhelmed, and within that space there can be a different kind of ease, not because everything is resolved, but because everything is allowed. Thoughts can come and go, feelings can rise and fall, experiences can shift and change, and awareness remains. This way of understanding being is not something that needs to be forced. It's not a new belief to adopt. It is more like a gentle noticing, something that can appear in small moments, when you pause, when you listen, when you allow experience to be just as it is, and perhaps over time, this noticing becomes more familiar, not as something special, but as something quietly present in the background of everything. And so, as we come to the end of this exploration, there is nothing that needs to be concluded, no final definition to hold on to, just a simple recognition that awareness, in its quiet, minimal form, has been here all along, before thoughts, before identity, before any attempt to understand it, and it continues now. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open, or you're already floating somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being part of this little journey. If you'd like to join me again for more gentle wanderings, you're always welcome to subscribe or share this with someone who could use a peaceful pause. Time has a way of slipping through our fingers, but here, in this quiet moment, it's just you and the soft hush of rest. Sleep peacefully, wherever and whenever you may be.